you, Chairman, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope. I would remind you that I am a born Roman. I was baptized in St. Peter's Cathedral. I haven't really stuck to that baptism, but and I do apologize, but I do know someone who has changed the legislation of the Vatican City, removed the death penalty there, and has also been to Lampedusa, an island belonging to my country near the African coast, and in my country where there have been a lot of measures to refuse illegal immigrants, and so my Argentine neighbor, my notable Argentine neighbor, has done a lot to change the situation for respecting prisoners' rights and reforming the justice system in my country. I'm trying to do a lot of things, as the chairman reminded us, but with very modest results. But I'm also trying to relearn French, so I do apologize for any mistakes you might hear in my presentation. Suzanne, in her presentation, has shown us that a carbon tax is possible. It can be fair. It can ensure redistribution of wealth and issues of international competitiveness of companies. It's good for the environment, for green priorities, for the economy, and it's important for the energy transition. And when we talk about these issues, it's very important to have as a basis science, what we know and what's available. One of the tools I find most useful is this illustration of the planet with an analysis of planetary boundaries. This was prepared by a Swedish scientist, Rökström, and with his colleagues he prepared an analysis of the ecosystems at risk. 3 of them are already beyond their limits, so the loss of biodiversity, problems with nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, problems also in the use of fresh water, and also the use of the oceans. We need a lot more work on that, but the scientific community has already provided us with a lot of data. There are also problems in the changes in land use, atmospheric aerosols, chemical pollution, and ozone at stratosphere level. I think those of you who know this will know Rökström's instrument. It's also useful to see what kind of instruments we use. There are specialists for who these tools will be very commonly known, but others might find it very interested to see what we use at the OECD, for example. The instruments we use for environmental policy, developing an economy that's low carbon. There are the traditional instruments of environmental policy, command and control systems, setting regulations, standards, limits, prohibitions, voluntary instruments which have been developed, which sometimes have a good impact, and economic instruments which are market-based. We developed them over time, and to those other OECD categories, there is also I'd also like to add the environmental assessment instruments, the assessment of projects, strategies, the development of various projects, an assessment of the cumulative results of all these projects in a same category, and also the development of mixed combined instruments. In the third category of instruments, there is tax with an environmental impact, tariffs, fees, charges, subsidies, whichever their form, be they incentives, aid, exemptions, tax credits, and obviously some are environmentally friendly and others are harmful to the environment. And Guillaume Santini has led a lot of work of analysis on the disastrous effect of some subsidies on the environment. There's the creation of markets where they didn't exist, such as with the ETS, emission trading schemes, pollution rights. There's also being experiments in the field of right to water, so with fishing quotas. There's also the market of insurances on climate risks, and there are white and green certificates on the use of renewable energies, energy efficiencies, minimum tariff systems for alternative and renewable forms of energy. And finally, the least interesting one is the sanction tool, fines and so on. So what is the international situation? In OECD countries, with the taxes with environment impacts represent 6.5% of revenue, tax revenue of the countries, 3 to 14% depending on the country. In terms of GDP, it represents roughly 2% with a variability of 1 to 5%. Obviously, tax on energy and transport represent the lion's share of the revenue in this sector, and that they have the greatest impact on the energy transition. And there's room for maneuver to use fiscal leverage to ensure energy transition. What's the level of ambition? The ambition is somewhat modest. I do recognize that. Should we look at the champions, the leaders in this sector, for example, Denmark with 12% of their tax revenue, Turkey, which is not yet in the EU but is or OECD country, it's 14%, or we saw recently Costa Rica, which has already reached a level of 18% of tax revenue from environmentally friendly taxes. The institution of the European Institute of Environmental Policies is considering a level of 30% for tax revenue. But for that purpose, you need instruments that are sustainable. And so there's a lot of analysis and knowledge that I work with. The OECD, the UNEP, the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, the European Union at all levels. It does a lot of excellent work in this field. The European Environment Agency. There's a series of scientific conferences on this subject, a network of experts called Green Budget Europe, which promotes tax reform and environmental reform. And I do report that late in September, there will be a global conference on environmental taxation, which will take place in Copenhagen. It'll focus on the energy and the energy market. Italy has launched an association of environmental economists, and we're holding our third conference soon in Padova. There's also a French conference now, which is having its first conference today and tomorrow in Montpellier. I don't encourage you to go there because there's a lot to do here, but it's interesting to know in any case. And there's also Green Budget Europe. Our annual conference will be in November in Brussels once the new Commission will have assumed its position. It seems compensation is possible in policies if there is a strong and a coherent will on the part of politicians. And there are very many examples from different countries. The first level of personal tax can have an impact on revenue. There can be green checks. Indonesia is quite an interesting case. They have subsidies for fuel. The government decided at one point to remove those subsidies since it distorted the economy and it wasn't good for the environment. And they distributed 18 million environment checks via post offices. If an emerging countries like Indonesia is capable of doing that, I think it's an instrument that can be used. Incentives to eco-innovation to compensate companies where there would be transitional problems, competitiveness problems, national or international, progressive tariffication for water or electricity based on consumption. Many countries use that already. That's the interpretation of Aldo's theory of marginal tariffs on electricity. That's the case in South Africa, where there's major social upheaval and there's a bracket of water use and electricity use, a minimum use for vital needs, which is provided free of charge or at a very low cost, and progressively that increases with uses that are less crucial. Economists don't like compensation and subsidy, but in transitional periods, even the more traditional-minded economists do recognize that it can be necessary to implement compensation and subsidy for transitional periods. You obviously have to set limits, and you have to set time limits in particular, but it is feasible. Over the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen a lot of work has been in preparation. Northern European countries and Germany are leading the way in fiscal reform. The Netherlands, Ireland is also working intensely. In France, for example, in the UK, there are green fiscal committees or commissions that are being set up. Portugal is working very intensely with a green tax commission that will be presenting the results of its work soon. Norway is preparing a third round of environmental and tax reforms. And even in Italy, there are attempts via a tax delegation. A government has been empowered to carry out a tax reform, and we have introduced an idea of environmental taxation explicitly, and there are 12 months to produce. Well, there are 4 months left to produce our work, and I am, with the optimism of reason and the pessimism of rationality, I can expect whatever results I expect. What are the policies to support energy transition? We could introduce new taxes. It's never a popular move, but we could also introduce new tariffs, new fees mechanisms, and we could also establish new markets there where we can use our governance capacities. We need to remove subsidies that harm the environment. It's ethically and politically a strong message, and we can introduce, where necessary, where useful, for transitional periods, subsidies that help the environment. A reference among many works that have been prepared recently is that global subsidies to fossil fuels are estimated at the level of $450 billion per year. That's OECD and IAEA figures, and subsidies to renewable energy are estimated at $60 to $90 billion per year, so a sixth of the level for fossil fuels, and it shows a lot what kind of work we can do. And without mentioning energy efficiency, for example, the factor 4 of energy innovation that we heard of earlier. This is a nice diagram to look at. We can't look at it in too much detail. You got to think about energy resource efficiency, a circular economy, as the Chinese call it, and with tax instruments we can correct the market, because often environmental tax or green tax eliminates distortions on the market and improves the competitiveness conditions and introduces fair competition, gets rid of privilege, and therefore has a role towards improving the market. I get to the end of my speech. Thank you.